there is a way, if you did store more business logic-y things in your database, to get some more performance, but then a way to hurt performance. So a performance benefit of putting that I've heard of some teams do of putting more business logic in the database is when they're working with JSON APIs. Because Postgres you can give it a query and it can return raw JSON. So what these teams have done for some of their APIs is that they just query the database and they take the raw JSON back and they just ferret it right out to the end user. So they bypass the ORM. So there's no object relational mapper because so no objects need to be instantiated. So it's super fast. And they don't have to build the JSON or do anything like that. It's just goes straight to them. And then you actually get to bypass a lot of Ruby processing. And you're essentially using C if you're using a Postgres database. So in general, it processes much faster than equivalent Ruby code would.
Yeah.
So that could be a benefit for like a JSON API, some performance benefits if you put that type of business logic in the database. Now, on the other side of it, what is the hardest thing to scale in your application? Or what are you going to hit the limit on in your application typically?
Well, for us, most of the time it's memory, but I guess that depends on your architecture.
On which server, for example?
Well, on most of our actual Ruby servers, because of all the object instantiations.
Okay, but well, sorry, I probably shouldn't have asked the question this way, but you could probably easily you can easily scale application servers. You can get more application servers. You can get 15, you get 20, you get 50. You could increase the size of those quite easily. But the problem, at least if you're running a relational database like Postgres or Oracle or MySQL, is there's typically, unless you're doing multi-master, there's typically only one database.
Yeah.
And if you want to make it bigger, you just got to keep going bigger and bigger. And you can't really scale out as easily as you can with application instances.
Right.
So that is where you can hit a barrier. The more business logic you put in your database, the slower it can do the things it is good at.
Right.
So handling concurrent access for thousands of connections to all of the data and keeping it consistent and locked appropriately so that not more than one person can change the data at once. So the more business logic you put in the database, you're going to hit that limit sooner.
Right. Yep.
And actually, that was a problem of this application, now that I think about it, the one from a couple of decades ago, in that it was actually the database that started having issues, the one that had all the stored procedures.
Yeah, and that used to be an even bigger problem before the advent of SSDs, because your hard drive access was typically a huge bottleneck in your system, and every time the database would read or write something, it's going into the hard drive. So the more stuff you put in there, the worse it got.
Yep.
You know, forgetting about caching and that kind of thing, there's stuff you can do in memory, but that's gotten to be a much less of a problem with SSD, but that's still a significant issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's basically because you can quite easily ramp up 50, 100, 200, I mean, however many application servers you want, or even worker boxes, you can go to the moon. But if you have a relational database and you don't have a service-oriented architecture, you've got one database. So the more that you ask it the more that you ask it to do, the more business logic you ask it to process, the slower it's going to be doing the other things that only it can do.
Right.
So that's an argument not to put too much business logic in your database.
Yeah. So I think the kind of the thinking here, the summary of this is you don't want to put things like flow control type business logic in your database. That doesn't make a lot of sense, even though you can do that to a point. Probably shouldn't, because there just isn't enough benefit there. You lose maintainability, you lose traceability, you slow your database down, because that's not the thing the database is good at. So probably shouldn't put those kind of things in there. You probably should almost always put constraint type logic in there, because that's what the database is for, making sure your data doesn't get screwed up. And that part of that are the constraints and the checks. So when most people talk about business logic, what they're thinking is more flow control and how the data is processed in the system. So if you define business logic like that, pretty much doesn't belong in your database. But that's not all your business logic, because data and its state is part of really your business logic. And so the control of that data and the safety of that data is really the job of the database. We're making the assumption that we're talking about relational databases here. This is a different conversation if you're talking about, flat file structures or things like Mongo and stuff like that. So we're talking about relational databases, but that's, the majority of apps are backed by relational databases. So
yeah, maybe it's more like, business rules, as opposed to business logic. So definitely your business rules for data and their relationships, all that definitely belongs in the database, as opposed to, trying to do something in your application.
Right. Now, do we say never put any business logic in your database? Not never, but if you're doing that, you probably ought to think hard about it, because there may be some back-end admin-y type things that functions would be good for, or that, stored procs would be good for. But probably if you're doing functions or stored procs, it's not a good idea. It's going to be a rare case. Especially if it's a stored proc or something that you're accessing from your code that does all your flow control, you probably want to look at that, because chances are that's not a good idea. So should you put business logic in your database? Yes and no. Depends on which business logic you're talking about. But flow control, no. Constraint, yes. Data safety, yes. Those kind of things, for sure.
If you like this clip and want to watch another one, you can click right here. Or if you want to watch the full video, you can click here.